Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Stellenbosch Business School's Leaders Angle event today. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm Anita Bosch. I hold the Women at Work Research Chair and teach in the leadership track at the Business School. Welcome to everyone attending today. It's the University of Stellenbosch Business School's Leaders Angle events that have become well sought after opportunities to reflect on aspects such as responsible leadership and how we can participate fully in inclusive and sustainable business in South Africa and on the African continent. And I'm honored to be in conversation about leadership, how it's made and how we maintain its health, as well as reflections on the year ahead with Professor Sim Tshabalala, Honorary Professor at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Prof Tshabalala is also the Group Chief Executive of Standard Bank. I'd like to invite you as participants to type questions into the chat that you would like to ask Prof Sim. And this is a golden opportunity, so please make use of it. At the end of the session, we'll open to the floor and invite you to ask questions directly to Sim. And we've tried to sort out these titles because, as you know, at university, Prof happens quite often. And Sim has said, please, he's just Sim. So we'll take it at that. And so I want to start off, Sim, by asking you, it feels to me as though we're starting to lift our heads out of the depths of COVID here at the beginning of the year, somewhat catching sight of what we might become and what lies ahead. And as the leader of the largest bank in Africa, with total assets worth nearly 173 billion US dollars and operations in 20 countries on the continent, what are your thoughts about what 2022 holds for business?
Well, Anita, thank you so very much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. And it's wonderful that you and I think, are in Joburg and some of our colleagues are in Cape Town. And I think that little cameo bespeaks what the world is all about, right? The ability to work hybrid, some people working physically and some people working remotely. And I'm sure we'll be debating that a bit later. But I think we're facing a lot of uncertainty in answer to your question. I think we're facing the possibility of war, I guess, in the Ukraine, tensions spiraling there, perhaps the possibility of war in China. And one would hope that these things don't eventuate. But we're also facing, I think, COVID continuing to improve thanks to vaccinations, more accurately targeted public health interventions, more available treatments, and that more and more people get exposed to the virus and get natural immunity. We also, I think, know from the IMF, in fact, in the last couple of days, they've been saying that, there definitely will be knock-on effects from Omicron, but they also point out that the world supply chains are going to take a while to recover from the disruptions from the pandemic. And if you read today's newspapers, whether it's the FT or the New York Times and so forth, everybody's worried about these clogged up supply chains, the spiraling cost of chips, and the implication that that's got for inflation globally. Our economists at Standard Bank reckon that we could see growth of between 4.5% to 5% globally. The IMF says 4.4%, but let's say it's between 4.5% and 5%. We are also hearing, and we saw Mr. Powell in the US talking about the possibility and the real likelihood of an increase in interest rates in March in the US. And everybody's expecting 4 25 basis point hikes, but we could have more, right? In response to inflation, the clogged up supply chains that I was referring to and so forth. I think when you turn to South Africa and the African continent, the IMF thinks that we'll grow at roughly 3.5%, between 3.5% and 3.8%. But that's also contingent on what happens with COVID. And there's no reason to disbelieve them. But we're also seeing interest rates increase throughout the continent as well, Mozambique, Zambia, and so forth. And then when you look at our own country, South Africa, clearly the IMF says we'll grow at roughly 2%. My view is that that is also contingent. You know, you could have accelerated structural reforms and you could have faster growth even in 2022. And it's all contingent. But I think we're not going to escape the impact of interest rate hikes. We saw today the MPC hiked interest rates by 25 basis points. And so the world is seeing faster growth, faster inflation, and therefore tightening of monetary policy. Perhaps let me stop there. I mean, I've said a lot. And let me just warn you, I've often warned people. I was born in Hlabisa in KZN. I'm Nguni, and we can talk. So you have to stop me when you feel the need to stop me.
I will, absolutely, but that's wonderful, you know, just the overview that you've presented, and within that there's so many aspects to that. If we think about China as one of the largest economies in the world and certainly a key driver, the Chinese government somehow always seems to kind of work contra to what is happening in the rest of the world, sort of as though they're on their own mission in a certain way. You spoke earlier on about the potential of a war there, or at least conflict there, and then also the Ukrainian you know, build-up that we're witnessing. So let's just for a minute sort of reflect on all of these dynamics. I mean, it's quite a volatile type of an environment. And a lot of people would say, well, we've just come through COVID, or at least a portion of COVID. Why is it then that people want to continue, you know, down this trajectory, and also with all of the questions about where COVID originated, what the reasons might be, the conspiracy theories and so on. So the world feels a bit prickly at the moment, as though we're all on edge, but also prickly in the sense that people are fighting with each other. Just your opinions about that, when one would say, well, why don't we all just say we've come through this now, or we're partly through it, at least there's lots of vaccines and so forth. Why aren't we just stepping into rebuilding and working together?
There's a lot there, Anita, and let me just maybe try and cover a couple of the points and the thoughts. I would say to you, the first one would be, it's important to reflect actually on catastrophes generally. And you and I were speaking earlier on. I'm reading a book currently about pandemics, the history of plagues. And frankly, Anita, whether you look at the Antonine Plague in Rome, which actually preceded the collapse of the Roman Empire, the plague of Athens that's spoken about by Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, that presaged the collapse of Athens as well. The Justinian plague that presaged also the accelerated collapse of the Roman Empire. In the East, the Black Death in the 1300s, the Spanish flu, and all of these plagues and these catastrophes. What is true after all of them is that the situation does revert to mean. So the first big point I would want to make to you is, yes, we are going through a 1 in 100-year event. It's got profound, pervasive, and probably long-lasting effects. But we know from history that, frankly, interest rates will revert to mean, inflation will revert, and economic activity will revert. Third, one of the really interesting things to notice is even in this pandemic, there are pockets of incredible economic activity. And the role of business and the role, I guess, of your students and your clients is to identify where those pockets of potential and activity are. So if you just look at in South Africa, you look at the retail sector, you look at the telecoms, you look at you look at the hospitals, you look at Netcare. They've positioned themselves well, even in the context of the pandemic, whilst the hospitality industry, the airlines, and so forth have struggled. That theme is a theme I think that is pertaining throughout the rest of the world. The next point is that after major catastrophes and after pandemics, you do have a tightening of economic policy. You always will have accelerated activity by governments. Governments get more and more involved in business and in economic activity. And in fact, you have a resurgence of industrial policy where governments start to intervene more directly in the economy. We are to expect that. And we as leaders need to identify opportunities there too, because there are actually opportunities arising from more direct industrial policy. From a South African perspective, in answer also to your question, there's no question that China is slowing down and actually is a drag on global growth. But it remains South Africa's largest purchasers of South African exports. They're at roughly 18.5%. We import a large proportion of our goods from them. Roughly 10.5% of our imports are from China. Our FDI stock, roughly 98 billion rand. There, China is roughly number 6, with the leader being the United Kingdom. The point of all of that is that what happens in China, therefore, gets transmitted to South Africa. It has a direct impact on, trade, investment, and as I said earlier, on the clogging up of supply chains, to the extent that supply chains for, chips for cars, if they are clogged up in China, that supply chain between China and South Africa has an impact on the automotive industry. In all of that, I think I will say it again, our role as business, your role as the universities is to keep figuring out what we would need to do to take advantage of the situation and improve the South African national competitive advantage. And it's a point I've made often with Mark as well. Perhaps let me stop there, Anita.
Yeah. Thank you for that, and I think very useful comments there. It's not all doom and gloom as life usually is, but that there are some very clear inflection points, and if we don't take care of those and sort of bootstrap ourselves, potentially yes, then we're in for more rough times. And I'm thinking very specifically here about also being able to weather storms, and being able to sit out whilst the world might be slightly tumultuous around us, our ability to actually do that. So at a business level, the ability to do that, and how do you see banks actually supporting this system and perhaps then the South African economy, in terms of these potential times of upheaval that are still to come?
So Anita, I would say to you, in South Africa, the opportunities for growth off the back of structural reforms, I think, are very exciting, even in these tumultuous times. And let me start by picking up on a point I made earlier on. I think that, as I said, the health, the ITC, the media, and the education sectors are doing exceptionally well. And when I look at the reported numbers of our clients, you will see that many businesses in the consumer, transport, logistics, and telecom sectors and media sectors have done pretty well during the pandemic. And that's because, it's understandable, right? People's consumption patterns have changed during lockdown, as have their health needs, which is why businesses like Netcare have done so very well. When I looked at the numbers from MTN, it's quite staggering that their revenues from data were up roughly 35% when they reported in September. And as I said, the flip side of that is that the hospitality industry is really flat on its back. It had started to recover towards the end of last year, and I think was knocked back by Omicron. And in our case of Standard Bank, throughout that period, we took the position that said we would stand by our clients, both individual and corporate, during these difficult times, and would continue to support them. We noticed in that process, as you are well aware, the acceleration of things that had been happening before the pandemic, like digitization. Would you believe that as we speak, I would say to you about 99% of our transaction volumes in South Africa are digital. When people say they don't believe me, and I'll ask you this question and I'll stop and let you answer me. When last were you at a branch to go and draw cash?
It feels like decades ago.
My point exactly. And so the point is that off the back of this dramatically changed world, patterns we'd been seeing prior to COVID have accelerated. So 99%. And, you know, when I look at, when we're preparing for our interim results, we had a look at this. We saw that there was a 19% increase in volumes of transactions on our mobile app. So I do most of my banking on this thing, you know. With Apple Pay, I even use this thing to pay at the tills. My point is that point around identifying opportunities, the resilience of South African business, the opportunities arising from the fact that we operate on the African continent and we live in a great neighborhood. And I know that this is something that you want to talk about as well. It's important to have identified those patterns and use the benefit that arises from them. I think the next point, of course, is that it doesn't help to always complain. And so we know that the challenge in South Africa is logistics, it's power, Eskom, it's the spectrum. Our duty is to keep making the case for the need to accelerate the structural reforms that will unleash our ability to move goods to our ports, to be able to generate our manufacturing and transport our manufacturing at the lowest possible cost, obviously, which is a combination of power and logistics. Make it easier for SMEs to operate, therefore release the spectrum so that more SMEs can become more active. And so, yeah, my argument here is to keep making the case for the need for acceleration of structural reforms. And if those structural reforms happen, the growth of 2% suddenly becomes, you know, trend growth above that 3, 4, 5%.
And would you say that there's that same growth pattern on the African continent? Standard Bank operates very extensively on the continent, and you have lots of experience about this. So what are your thoughts about our continent, which very often, you know, when you fly over the continent, let's say you're on your way to Europe, and you look at the dark patches, especially in the middle, where you don't see a lot of electricity and so forth. You know, scholars very often write quite negatively about our neighborhood. In your experience of doing business on our continent, what are your thoughts about that? I see also there's a question, for instance, in the chat about any Africa or intra-Africa ECOWAS events that we should perhaps look at that might have an impact on the rest of the continent, or perhaps even for positive outcomes on the continent. So just your thoughts on the continent and doing business here.
So, Anita, one of the reasons I'm associated with Stellenbosch is that that great institution gives us the opportunity to talk to people about Standard Bank. So I unashamedly am going to advertise. And I will make the following points without shame. Number one, we are in 20 countries on the African continent, and it's mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. We are not in the Maghreb, and we are in roughly 75% of African GDP. And so we see a lot of the movement of goods, people, ideas, and capital. So that's the first big point I would want to make. And so when your colleagues and students are in doubt and they want to have any advice about the African continent, they can call Standard Bank. And I say so without any shame. I did say earlier on, Anita, that the IMF was reckoning that African growth would be roughly 3.8% on the whole. But I think if you think about the medium-term outlook, we're seeing growth at around 4% per year towards 2026, and then a continued acceleration after that. We think that over the years to come, the beauty about Africa is its incredibly rich population. It's a large population which continues to grow, and it will continue to grow quickly. It'll continue to get healthier, so there are opportunities for retail and health. People will become wealthier, more disposable income, fantastic for services and for businesses such as ourselves. They become better educated, more urbanized, and urbanization is obviously exciting from an investment point of view. The building of, roads, bridges, cities in general. They become more digitally connected. More and more people are having access to phones, smartphones, and therefore the internet, and therefore they're becoming more productive. It's an exciting part of the world to operate in as a consequence, if you face retail and also if you face corporates. The colleague that is asking about intra-Africa trade, absolutely. We think that, we expect trade and investment flows inside Africa between Africans, and then in fact between Africa and the wider world to continue to accelerate. And definitely the benefits of the African continental free trade area are going to be very, very exciting. I think it's quite interesting to note, Anita, that, for example, if you just look at us as South Africa, our trade, of our top 10 trading partners, only one is African, and that's Nigeria, and they're roughly number 6. They purchase roughly 4% of our exports. Of the 10 countries that import our stuff, Botswana, Mozambique, and Namibia are number 6, 7, and 8 in that list. Sources of foreign direct investment, none in the top 10. No, I lie. Mauritius is in the top 10. Sorry. FDI from Mauritius is in the top 10. My point is that there are vast opportunities for growth in trade and investment intra-Africa. And yeah, the colleague is right. The Africa Free Trade area is an important opportunity for all of us. In fact, if one thinks about the most successful of the regional blocks on the African continent, it's actually the East, correctly so. We operate in Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And it is incredible to see the trade that is happening there, the ease with which people move between those borders, and then the increased productivity of that region. One last point on this, which is something, again, that I've spoken to you and with Mark about, which is, it is amazing how competitive the East has become. And to such an extent that the global big techs, the hyperscalers, Microsoft and so forth, are now opening their head offices in Nairobi and not in Johannesburg. And it's something that South Africans must deal with and reflect upon. Why is that happening? Well, it's happening because the education system is better. Ease of doing business is greater. They score better than South Africa on ease of doing business. that is why, for example, you've got the development of businesses like Safaricom, which are a nightmare for us, M-Pesa in financial services. My point being, the regional competitive advantage in tech is definitely being won by the East. Now, why is that the case when we've got Stellenbosch, we've got UCT, we've got the University of Johannesburg, we've got WITS, we've got the financial services sector, we've got all the components that could make us really, really competitive. In a way similar, not dissimilar to, Tel Aviv, Berlin, and so forth.
Yeah,
Perhaps let me stop there.
Yeah, when we think about the political instability, where we started off with the conversation also in the Ukraine and other parts of the world, and certainly those of us who know South Africa well, very well versed with that instability and the uncertainty, the policy uncertainty that brings with it. And for a business, obviously, to operate in any jurisdiction, is you're looking for a measure of certainty that you can trade, that there's the laws are being upheld, that there's a good mechanism for you to make your money and get your money out. I think those are points where the banks also then play a major role. But on that point then, Sim, I want to probe you a little bit about one of your colleagues, Ian Stanton, saying in the media a while back when he had to go and deliver his he was asked to make some submissions to the Zondo Commission, and what he said was the only day that he ever saw his direct leader, and that was you, very angry, was the day when you were called in to Luthuli House by the ANC after you had closed the Gupta accounts at Standard Bank. And that was the only day that he's ever seen you being very upset. Now, in my interactions with you, I've also observed that you are very measured, quite calm, collected. I've watched the numerous of your interviews, even with interviewers that really are like these little dogs that keep yapping at one's ankles. You remain calm. So is that something that's developed over time? Are you deliberately practicing that? Tell us a bit more about this ability to actually just be calm, even in the face of, let's say, being attacked.
Anita, let's start first with the meeting we had with the ANC that you're referring to. I mean, it's public knowledge because I wrote a letter to the ANC subsequent to that meeting, which was published. I think it found its way to the press, and it was so people are aware of what that meeting was about and what was said. Our approach at Standard Bank is to say, first of all, we are, as I said to you, the largest financial institution on the African continent. By the way, Anita, I don't know if you're aware, we were founded in 1862. So this year in October will be our 160th anniversary. And in fact, it's under the same name, except for one little detail. When we were founded, we were called the Standard Bank of British South Africa Limited. Today, it's just the Standard Bank. And in fact, we were founded by wool traders in the Eastern Cape who wanted to provide services to wool traders as they were manufacturing, as they were producing their goods and selling them to the United Kingdom. That's the history of the Standard Bank. You might say very colonial. I will say,
like a merchant bank, in other words, a type of a merchant bank.
It actually started out as a merchant bank. They were facilitating trade and investment. Now you might argue about colonialism, but let's leave that for a debate for another day. My point is that it's an old institution. Secondly, we believe very strongly in the purpose of the organization, and our purpose is Africa is our home, we drive our growth. In that sense, we view the organization as an important organ of society with a duty to add value to all of society, our clients, our staff, society in general, and stakeholders, including political parties. And so as a matter of course, we meet with political parties. And we try and do that once a year, and it's transparent. And we have robust conversations with them. And so when the ANC asked to meet with us to have this discussion, we went to the meeting and held a discussion with them. It was frank, it was robust, and I would say to you it was productive because we were able to give them a perspective of what we stand for, the things we will do and the things we will not do, and under what circumstances. I make those points to say to you, one of the important things about that vision and that purpose of the Standard Bank Group is that it's got an ethical code and a set of values which I believe in, and I believe it matches my own set of values and my own set of principles.
Yeah,
and so
sorry, I just wanted to ask you about that. Where does that come from? That set of values that you have also.
My personal ones or Standard Bank's set of values?
Your personal ones that matches Standard Bank's one so very specifically, because I know there's a whole layer to this of matching Standard Bank's ones, and we'll get to the business schools ones as well. So please, if you could just also add that's to what you're explaining.
Okay. Okay. So all right. So I'll come to that. So there's Sim's personal values and there's the organization's values, trying to explain how one responds to business issues, whether they be customers, individuals, corporates, organs of society, political parties, etc., and conflict. And I was arguing to you that because I have a set of values that matches the organization's, and I see my duty as being to all stakeholders, and I see it as being based on strong ethical foundations, I quite comfortably and happily deal with people on the basis that there's a job to be done that is in the best interest of the company and the best interest of its stakeholders. And therefore, I prepare conversations, I prepare meetings and conflict on that basis. And so whilst there may be tough situations, I know that I'm doing a job. I'm a steward at a great institution which has existed for a long time. And I believe implicitly in its vision, in its purpose, and therefore I'm quite comfortable to defend it, if you know what I mean, even when I'm under attack. Bringing it back to where these come from, I believe, let me tell you a quick story before I come to my own set of beliefs. In 1933, the founder of Panasonic was asked by a friend to come to a shrine, a Japanese traditional shrine, Shinto is the religion, right? And at that visit, he noticed and started to believe that there were actually similarities between business management and religion. And he ended up saying, and if I could just quote what he said, because I really, really find it fascinating in the context of our discussion and debate, he said this, he said, human beings need both material and spiritual prosperity. Yeah. Religion guides people out of suffering towards happiness and peace of mind, and businesses too can contribute by providing physical necessities required for happiness. This should be the primary mission of a business. And Anita, as a result of that experience, he assembled all his workers and he made an announcement to them. And he said this to them. He said, the mission of a manufacturer is to overcome poverty by producing an abundant supply of goods. Even though water can be considered a product, no one objects if a passerby drinks from the roadside tap. That is because the supply of water is plentiful and its price is low. Our mission as a manufacturer is to create material abundance by providing goods as plentiful and inexpensively as tap water. This is how we can banish poverty, bring happiness to people's lives, and make this world a better place. So making this world a better place is an important part of what business does. And I think it sounds like what USB is trying to do. And we'll come back to that. So there's that purpose about an organization. There's something bigger than yourself in being part of a great institution like Standard Bank, along the lines of what Matsusita said. I went to a Catholic school, just to close the argument. And one of the fundamental tenets of that school was the ethos. And one of the elements of that ethos is humanism and humanity. And an important element of it was the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who believed in natural laws. So that's the first. Secondly, if you have time, and if your colleagues want, there is a book by Chris Lowney called Heroic Leadership, Best Practices from a 450-year-old company that changed the world. And in that book, he compares the Jesuits to the great JP Morgan, that great bank that we all admire. And he speaks in that book about the 4 principles of Jesuits, this 450-year-old company. The first one is heroism. Always aim for something high and aim for something great. Indifference, he means by that, you must let go of attachments or possessions or emotions that hold you back. Just always do the right thing. Third, love, just deep reverence for humanity. And last, self-awareness. The inscription at the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself and nothing in excess. So true, and that is as true for religious people, I believe, as it is for business people. So be grounded in principles, and I think those principles match the great principles that guide the great institution that is Standard Bank. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. I mean, that's such a wonderful layout of sustainability, is it not? In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, the ideas that business is not there as a primary means to enrich shareholders, but that it really is situated in society. It speaks actually most likely to most of our modules that we have on the MBA, what we inculcate and try and pass on to students. It absolutely speaks to the business school's vision to be a source of value for a better society. And one can start seeing why you are an honorary professor at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, just in terms of bringing all of these parts together and the idea that a business can actually serve society and not necessarily the other way around, as capitalism very often is seen and portrayed. Linking to that, I want to just pulse you a little bit then about people that feel disenfranchised and underrepresented groupings in business, in society, in South Africa, and across the African continent. There are many, many demands placed on business leaders, legitimate demands, for an organization to become much more inclusive. You are a he for she ambassador, and Standard Bank is also, quite involved with that. But for you as a leader, how do you construe of diversity, transformation, and inclusion?
So firstly, just to say that I'm very proud that Standard Bank was a sponsor, and as a consequence, I had the privilege of being a he for she ambassador. But because the sponsorship has come to an end, I'm no longer an ambassador, but I still believe in the reasons for having been part of that program and that purpose, and very committed to gender equality. And I believe in it both for business and for personal reasons, like you say. I think the issue around gender equality and exclusion and inclusion, I think, has to be understood in the context, in my view, of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa with its Bill of Rights. And that is also consistent with global norms coming from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the great treaties that the world has entered into that guide public international law. And an important element of all of that is human dignity. So you also make reference, Anita, to all of these great instruments like the UN development goals and so forth. And all of these are fundamental in guiding us as we think about our duties as a business. So I would agree with that. At Standard Bank, and I personally, we believe that a business is not something that is outside society, it's an organ of society. And so in that context, we need to be creating value for all the different elements of society. And therefore, you have to be committed to meeting the needs of your shareholders. You have to deliver against the demands of society to pay your taxes, for example. You have to contribute to more inclusion in the economy in the sense of capitalism as we understand it on the African continent, in Asia, and in large parts of Europe, shot through with principles of social solidarity. Therefore, in that context, I believe, like those that believe in growing the pie, rather than trying to take away from different stakeholders. So I would say to you, it's perfectly legitimate for a Standard Bank to want to maximize its profits and at the same time make a contribution to inclusion through its policies, through its investments, and through what it does. If I may, just to give you a few data points to illustrate that concretely, to move from the high theory right down to concrete and to illustrate these principles of inclusion. Standard Bank on the continent, would you believe, employs 50,000 people. 50,000 people. Of those, roughly 30,000 are in South Africa. Now, the multiplier in financial services is 3. So we sustain 90,000 jobs in South Africa. It's staggering, but it's true. 90,000 jobs. You can take it a step further then and say, well, how many families do we sustain by being focused on growing the pie, as I say, right? We paid tax of about R1 billion in South Africa last year. But in 2020,
you could fund SAA, could you?
Indeed. But hear me out. Listen to this. In the year before that, the year before the pandemic, the figure was 4.2 billion rand.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And that's a typical year. On any normal year, Standard Bank pays that order of magnitude. But if you consider what we pay throughout the continent, in addition to our operations outside South Africa, it's 10 billion rand.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, we paid about 9.5 billion rand in dividends. And that normally happens in an ordinary year. And here's the thing. The recipients of those dividends are not fat cats. They're ordinary savers and pensioners. And that's an important consideration. Anita, in 2020, we paid 103 billion rand in interest to depositors and to people we'd insured. We paid 34 billion rand in salaries to staff. We paid 48 billion rand to suppliers and service providers. And in providing those products and services, we are insistent. And in procuring those products and services, we're insistent on transformation. And so even as we drive our business, we believe that part of the South African national competitive advantage and our own competitive advantage is about driving the transformation of South African business, allowing Black businesses into our supply chain and value chain. And lastly, let me stop by saying this to you in this context of the, inclusion and diversity. Diversity and inclusion and transformation in the South African context are fundamental because they increase your competitiveness. The reason we believe in it in South Africa, in Standard Bank, is we believe that by getting it right makes our business more competitive by virtue of the people that we have to serve on the African continent.
Yeah.
Thanks,
which,
Anita.
which is incredibly diverse as well. I'm taken by those figures and the numbers of people that you mention. I'm just thinking about very large universities in South Africa, and so Standard Bank could be compared in terms of student numbers, you know, to the institutions with 30,000 and more students. So you know, quite a massive player on the continent. And so leading this very, very large organization, a Nguni man from Hlabiso, proudly so, coming through that journey. Just tell us a bit about where did it start, and why did you decide specifically to enter the world of work, of the corporate world, the world of banking? Why that?
So, Anita, okay, so let me start right at the beginning, because my story is actually a classic South African story. I was born in Hlabisa, which is in KZN. My parents worked in the hospital there at the time. And for family reasons, I then very early on went to go and live with my maternal grandparents. So my mother grew up in Burgersdorp, which is in the Northeastern Cape. And so I went to live with my maternal grandparents, who are as short as I am. My grandfather was the headmaster of the local school. Principal Masoka was his surname. And my grandmother was a primary school teacher. That's relevant because I think they instilled in me a lifelong passion for learning, real privilege. But I also learned the humiliation of being an African in that little town, because I can remember my grandfather, who was a dignified school principal, calling the town manager, the town clerk, whatever he was, Baas Fourie. Can you remember that? Baas Fourie. And I will never forget that. Here's this dignified, sophisticated school principal, and he calls a peer Baas Fourie. Anyway, so I grew up there. Then I came to live with my parents in Johannesburg when circumstances had changed, and went to a school called Ndondo. Initially Ndondo, junior primary, and then Ndondo primary school. Around standard 3, my dad, let me add, my dad was an entrepreneur. He ran a business called Chicken Upeu. Now, Upeu, the colleague asked about East Africa. Upeu means chicken horizon. So foresight, entrepreneurship, etc. And I think from him, I learned also the abiding passion for education, but also for entrepreneurship, you know, getting things done. And I'm very proud of my dad for that. They sacrificed and sent me to a great school, Sacred Heart College. I then went to do a BA and an LLB at your competitor, Rhodes University. I'm very proud of that, but I went to Rhodes, did a BA, LLB, majoring in philosophy and legal theory in my junior degree. Then did articles at the great law firm Bowman and Gilfillan. Hated it. I hated it with a passion. And one of the partners at the time noticed that while I loved the law, I hated practice, and he suggested that I go and study. And
you see, professor, that was always, it was meant to be. Sorry, I interjected that, but couldn't, if I just think of a philosophy of law, it comes through, doesn't it?
Yeah, I then went off to Notre Dame and then did an LLM at Notre Dame. That's relevant because it's also a Catholic university run by the Society of Jesus, and not the Society of the Holy Cross, as opposed to Jesuits. Remember, I told you about the Jesuit principles. This is the Holy Cross. Came back and made up my mind that the law was not for me. I then joined a small boutique that was specializing in structured finance. worked with them for a number of years, and left them in early 2000 to go and join the Great Standard Bank. And I've been there since the year 2000. And then did various jobs. Initially ran structured finance, then ran the operations outside South Africa, then ran the retail bank, then ran SBSA, and I now have the privilege of being the CEO. All of that is relevant because it tells you the story of a South African with all the passion that comes with being South African, all the humiliations, and all the great things that South Africans do, the sacrifices that thousands, millions of South Africans, the sacrifices they make for their children, providing them with education, instilling in them values, passion for doing the right thing, and passion for competitiveness. So I think, yeah, let me stop there. That's the brief story of my life and my professional development. But I think it's got a lot to do with being lucky, being at the right place at the right time, having people around you, whether they be family, friends, mentors, or colleagues, that made it possible for you to have these opportunities. And for that, I'm very privileged.
Yeah. And some people would say it's not a matter of luck. That, the story that you've outlined, there was a lot of dedication embedded under that. In the story, there's a lot of effort that went into it. You didn't, arrive one day and become CEO the next day. A lot of preparation in terms of your own studies, your career, learning from these mentors, this great mentor, your father, and the example that he set, and your mother as well, and their wishes, their well wishes for you. And last, I didn't ask you about this, but what were their wishes for you?
I think they wanted only the best for me. One of my favorite authors, for example, is Chinua Achebe. And that's why? Because my dad loved him. They wanted me to. One of my heroes is Charlotte Maxeke. My office actually faces that great hospital. Why? Because my mother never stopped talking about Charlotte Maxeke. A love for education, a love for growth and for development, and an abiding passion for our beloved continent.
Yeah. Which are such strong roots, and then shows the authenticity with which you can step into the role that you have stepped in. You can take it up as you've explained, and also the way in which the value set ties into that, which is essential and tells us something about leadership journeys, this idea whether leaders are born or made, and the shaping of an individual, and how much care and attention it actually does take, but also the commitment and putting your hand up and saying, here I am here, and I'm ready to take that up.
Yeah. Which
brings me to the next question about this idea of CEO mania, where CEOs become celebrities. There's zillions of demands on CEOs, lots of expectations, and many people would say, it's often said, power corrupts. How do you ensure that you remain level-headed and not captured by this power that comes your way in the role that you fulfill?
Anita, a couple of things. First of all, I'll go back to what my grandparents, my aunts, my family. In fact, one interesting thing about my family is that it is a family of very strong women with high principles, old-fashioned, old school, conservative. And I use the word advisedly, old school and conservative, old-fashioned values. And I think that's got a lot to do with it. Secondly, speaking of women, I live in a home with 3 incredibly bright and powerful women, my daughters and my wife, and they keep me grounded in their own special ways, in many different ways. I was telling you the other day that on a Sunday, I love waking up, buying the newspapers, cooking, washing the dishes, and it's part of our tradition in our home, and that's important because it helps you staying grounded. Humility means, remaining grounded. Thirdly, I think the story, Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman emperor, who wrote the Meditations, which are worth reading. They're fantastic. But there's a story that wherever he went, he would have a person with him, and if anybody praised him, he would whisper in his ear, "You're just a man. You're just a man. You're just a man. You're mortal. You're just a man. You're just a man." And it's important to have people that have got your best interests at heart, who are able to tell you that when you start believing your own PR. So that's very important. And then lastly, I also have the privilege of working in an institution of great people. One of the great things about the Standard Bank is just the vast number of exceptionally good people who also keep you grounded. They do remind you from time to time, but you're just a man. You're just a man. And the team that I am privileged to lead is superb. Each of them excellent at their positions. And I know Kenny Fisher, the head of CIB. Kenny is the quintessential investment banker. I will never be equal to him, but that's great. That's fine. Funeka Munchane, who runs consumer and high net worth. Margaret Ninabo, who runs client solutions. They know infinitely more than I'll ever know about the gentle art of retail banking and vehicle and asset finance. And they, in their own way, continue to say, "You're just a man. You're just a man."
You remind me so much about what my father used to say. We were 4 girls, and then my mom and my father, and he would start a conversation saying, "So amongst us girls," and then proceed with whatever he was saying. Sort of a very strong identity rooted in some of these values. There's some questions that are coming up. There's just a last question that I want to ask, and then I'm going to start handing over, looking at what's in the chat, because there's some fabulous questions there. If you had to choose all over again, what would you do differently in your career? What would have perhaps even helped you if you had known it earlier on? Any reflections on that?
In terms of doing anything differently, I wouldn't change things. I mean, I don't regret my career projection. So no, nothing fundamental. There are a number of things, though, that I would have done sooner and faster. Things ranging from when you know that the team dynamics don't work and you know why they're not working, and you take 2 years to deal with it. It's a regret, and many of us can think of those instances. Secondly, another important thing is being forthright with clients. It's as important to be honest with the client and say, "No, we cannot lend you because your cash flows don't support the loan that you want." And saying so early rather than later is another lesson. Being able to have those tough conversations with dignity but firmly much earlier. My health. So I've been privileged to have good health, but I wish I had eaten better over the last few years. Thank God for the last 2 years because I've been working from home. But there was a time when, like most people, I traveled a lot and ate badly. So that I would do differently. Just be a bit more disciplined and look after your health.
Yeah, which is essential. I mean, to keep up with the pace at which you need to work and the demands that are on your shoulders. And I'm reminded about that. And this, "You're just a man, you're just a man." But thinking about those examples that you've mentioned just is really about how to disappoint somebody when it's right to actually, in other words, you have to have the courage to disappoint them in what they're asking of you, because you have to be firm about what you can and can't do. And that is sort of an art that one kind of has to move into. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to an individual to be able to step into that.
Yeah. saying no or dealing with conflict is hard for most people. And doing that firmly, but also preserving the other person's dignity. Very hard.
Yeah, and the theme of dignity coming through. Thank you so much for that. For the moment, I have loads of other things to ask you, but I'm going to jump into the chat and see. Ewan has asked here, is structural change and infrastructure investment enough on its own to make growth more pro-poor to help address wider inequalities?
So no, Ewan is 100% correct. I think it's what do you, Professor, say? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, right?
Yes.
It's an important element of what is needed. So in other words, fixing the roads, fixing the logistics, the infrastructure, fixing our power situation, dealing with that. So those, I suppose, are issues of the flesh, but issues of the spirit are important to deal with poverty and inequality. Put it differently, the hard infrastructure is as important as the soft infrastructure. So we do need to fix, the health system, upgrade the education system, preserve the rule of law. So this massive debate on the go right now around law and the rule of law. I mean, as a failed lawyer, I would say to you, it is fundamental to be able to trust that people will keep to their side of the bargain. And therefore, law is important in that context. And as a banker, if you lend somebody money, you have to trust that they'll be meeting their obligations as they fall due. And if they don't, you'll be able to rely on the legal system for you to recover that money, which, by the way, is not money that belongs to you because you're a custodian of other people's deposits. And it's therefore important for you to be able to do that. So I think the colleague is 100% correct. It's not enough. There's issues around, starting right at the top, the constitution, the values, and then making sure that the systems of allocating resources in the country are fair, they're transparent, and that goes a long way to addressing issues around poverty and inequality.
So just to follow up on Ewan's question really is the idea of capitalism, whether capitalism is a failed concept and whether capitalism can really actually help deal with poverty on this earth. So structural reform, together with the notion that perhaps capitalism is not really the economic model that'll get us out of poverty. Some thoughts about that.
So I take you back to a couple of points I made earlier on. I submit to you that it can, but it depends on the type of capitalism you're talking about. So if you're talking about, Milton Friedman's famous statement, the job of management is the maximization of profits. That's their only social responsibility. That's the one brand, and I don't subscribe to that. I think that's short-sighted. And of course, if you think about that tradition, it was very strong in the Anglo-American tradition, and in the English, the US, Australia, Canada, and indeed South Africa. Many business schools taught that. I'm saying no, there's a different type, and that's what I was advocating for, which says the job of business or the job of SIM is, yes, maximize profits, because you need to generate returns that adequately reward your investors for the risks that they've taken in you. Yes, you got to meet your clients' needs at a cost acceptable to them, even as you try and generate those returns. Yes, you must meet your obligations to society by helping to grow the pie, making that pie bigger, contributing to society's need for fairness and so forth. Yes, you must contribute to, net zero as soon as is reasonably practical, because you've got a duty to future generations. And I use the notion of stewardship in that context as an executive. So I'm in the school of thought that says yes. So I would argue that yes,
still plays a
it
role.
can contribute, yeah.
Yes, a major role. Owen, our head of marketing, says, is there still a need for BEE legislation in South Africa? Or what should be done to transform our society? I suppose that question is more related to transforming the ownership component, of our society.
So one of the fundamental tenets of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. So if you read, you've got to read the preamble to the Constitution. It is beautiful. It's lyrical.
I agree.
And it speaks about righting the wrongs of the past. It speaks about South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And it commits all of us to a better and brighter future. Mm-hmm. The Bill of Rights in that context speaks about, as I said, in fact, the rule of law, first, second, and third generation rights. So the classic civil rights, as well as economic rights, and then as well as rights that relate to the environment and future generations. So I think we've got the rubric in our country for a great future. The issue is actually execution. How does execution happen? Well, you've got legislation that forces us and drives us in the direction of transformation. The Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act, the Equity Act, the Companies Act, in fact, the Competition Act. All of these pieces of legislation are calculated to create a better and fairer environment in the context of the Constitution, and driving the creation of equal opportunity. And so my argument to people is that the failure is not so much the ethos and the Constitution and the principles and the rules. The failure has been in the execution. And so I'm in the school that says, I believe BEE is still necessary. I believe transformation is necessary. And I believe it's necessary not just for philosophical reasons, but remember what I said to you, as an officer of Standard Bank and as a businessman, I believe it's necessary because it goes towards the national competitive advantage. The better we do this, the more competitive South Africa becomes, the bigger the pie that I was referring to, the fairer the environment. So that would be my argument. Thanks.
Thank you for that answer. And then Ashanapi Panta, also from the business school, asked, as an international bank with its roots in Africa and having a footprint in 20 countries on the continent, is it right to assume that your view of Africa is different from that of international banks from outside Africa? Many non-African banks shy away from investing in development-oriented projects such as infrastructure assets because of their perception of risk.
I would submit that our view is fundamentally different to all of them because, remember what I said, our purpose is Africa is our home, we drive her growth. Africa is our, and we used emotional language to describe it. What more emotional attachment can you have than to a home? The notion of warmth, home, shelter, protection, and so forth. And then the second dimension of that purpose is growth. And here we're referring to growth in the economy, GDP growth, because we're a financial institution, but because the soft infrastructure I was referring to is necessary, we also want to contribute to it. Hence our commitment to health, education, even as we are contributing to the facilitation of trade, the movement of goods, people, and capital and ideas. In addition to that, we have been on the continent through thick and thin. So I said to you, the company's been in existence since 1862, and I beg you not to hold me accountable for the colonial past. And if you ask me that question, I will decline to answer it. But on a serious note, we are very different to those international banks. When things are tough on the continent, we're still here. In Nigeria, during the most difficult periods, we've stayed. In Zimbabwe, at the height of hyperinflation, we did not leave. In the DRC, we've made losses year after year after year. We've not left, and so forth. And so we are very different to those international players. Our competitive advantage actually is our knowledge of the continent, our understanding of its risks, and our ability, therefore, to generate returns that adequately compensate investors for the risks taken. I have to say, however, because this issue around investing in infrastructure and the role of banks is an important one. Banks are not geared to lend into projects for 20, 30, 40 years. Basel, the rules that govern us, force you to take deposits and make sure that those deposits are repaid. So that, in effect, the deposits that you take must match the lifetime of the loans that you advance. So if there's a mismatch, you are risky, and therefore you are heavily regulated for that. Insurance companies, pension funds, development finance institutions are better able to match the assets that they have with their liabilities, which are more long-term. But our role is to facilitate that, and that's what we do on the content. And it's an important point to make, because one of the criticisms people level at commercial banks, they say, oh, you're conservative, you're risk averse. And the answer is guilty as charged. Because when you have your salary's been deposited by Stellenbosch, and you go and make a payment at the restaurant, you want to pay. I can't come back to you and say, well, your loan is tied up in a toll road for 20 years. Please wait. People want their money to be paid on demand, and therefore you have to match your liabilities with your assets. I hope that provides some color.
Yeah, I think that's quite useful, and thinking about, what types of institutions are really the vehicles for this, and not asking, like I said before, all the demands towards a leader and so forth. Also knowing what to ask when and where. There's fabulous comments, which definitely will give to you also afterwards. I'm just trying to focus on the questions, and I think there's some questions about coaching, and whether you're interested in becoming involved with mentorship and coaching. Just tell us a bit of how do you utilize that within Standard Bank, and in general, the role that you have at the moment. How do you view coaching and mentoring?
So this is a very interesting one, Anita, and I often debate this with colleagues and with myself. In our institution, people often ask me, please mentor me, please coach me. And I've taken a view, rightly or wrongly, that given the fact that we employ 50,000 people, and given the fact that Standard Bank Services Society it's a banker to the nation, what is the fairest way to provide people with mentorship and coaching? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I can't think of a fair way to do that other than those people that report directly to me and that have got a direct impact on the activities of the institution for which I work. Any other principle is unfair. I can't think of a fair way to say, okay, I'll mentor this one and not mentor that one. There's the question of fairness, but then there's also the question of practicality. As you have alluded, these jobs are incredibly difficult and incredibly hard. And we are time starved. The time is of the essence, and it's very, very hard then to provide the time. One of the ways of dealing with that, of course, is we contribute, and I contribute in a way that can be leveraged, which is actually one of the reasons I agreed to participate in USB. I think I can leverage then my influence by doing that, by touching a larger number of people rather than one-on-one. In addition then to my job, because I'm a player coach, right? I coach on the field, I mentor on the field at work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And more than that is just not practical. I believe it's important, but it's very hard given my role.
Yes, yes. There's also Mark Smith that says he really appreciates your calmness and clarity and values. And he says he participated in a conference this morning where as a speaker identified climate change and cybersecurity as the major challenges facing us societies these days. And he would add also inequalities. You have mentioned both inequality and climate in this interview. How do you see cybersecurity risks for South Africa and for Africa?
So cybersecurity is perhaps the single biggest threat that faces financial institutions. You would not believe the amount of money we spend on processes, IT, and people. We employ vast numbers of security officers. We employ a large number of compliance officers. We've got a large number of engineers and security specialists who are focused on cybersecurity, because we know that the bandits or cyber criminals run large businesses. In fact, there are towns in certain parts of the world that have got these businesses who on a Friday afternoon stop working and activity slows down as a consequence, and it picks up again on the Monday morning because they are businesses. We also know that 9 to 5. 9 to 5. We also know that some of these are state-sponsored and they've got vast resources. And so cybersecurity is a big issue. We also know of instances where banks have come very close to being taken over by cyber criminals. I can't tell you the number of attacks that we suffer every single day, thousands and millions of attacks. And so you have to have systems and processes in place to protect you. Fortunately, South Africa, we are proud to say, is very sophisticated. It's expensive for the cyber criminals to attack in South Africa, but they are focused on us. You know, the attacks are relentless. They don't stop. But I think we are equal to them. Can I just comment quickly on the issue of climate change, yes, poverty, inequality, and because they're important. I think it's important to remember that you can't divorce the health risks that we face, the development of COVID, from the climate issues, because disease is actually an energy issue. Epidemiologists and scientists tell us that germs, viruses, are in effect looking for energy. And one of the causes of COVID was actually an environmental issue and environmental degradation. And you cannot separate them. And what we also know is that the hardest hit by these are actually the poor, people at the bottom of the pyramid. And so in addressing, the health issues, COVID, Omicron, and the trajectory, and the next pandemic that is going to hit us has to be addressed at the same time as you address the energy issues, at the same time as you address the health issues. Because as I say, not health issues, the inequality issues, because the people who are hardest hit are the marginalized, people who don't have access to resources. Thanks, Anita.
And that trying to convince, and I'm very often asked by students, by business leaders, what is the business case, for equality? What is the business case for inclusion? Give us the business case for including more women. And you think that this is such a self-evident case, as you've just alluded to. It's so simple to quite frankly understand and put out there, but yet the disbelief, as though we're sort of operating businesses in a bubble apart from society. And that's most probably the biggest fracture that happened with the Industrial Revolution at that time, when families were removed from businesses and separated, and the workplace became something, a sort of a oddity in a certain way, and a place where you would be separate from the rest of society. And it's that legacy we still keep living. Most likely that there would be a way for us to overcome it or start breaking down those barriers, because most of us are back at home now, working from home. I asked you at the beginning of the interview, you have a beautiful background. Is that your background, or is it a fake background? And you said you're at home. So, that type of work at home and integrating society back into the fabric of what we do every day with our value set. Really, really essential. We have a few minutes if there's anybody that would like to unmute and ask a question. And just before we have a barrage of people, if I can just ask you to raise your hand, the raise hand function, and then we can. Lebi, I see you the first on the draw. Lebi Tolo, please unmute yourself if you'd like to ask some question.
Hi, Anita. Thank you very much for the interview. Very inspiring. The reason why I'm raising my hand, I'm the first one, is because I think you missed my question. But I'll just.
So sorry, Lebi. Please pose it.
Yeah, I'll just try to summarize it quickly. I think it's quite interesting that I'm interested to know about the transition that Sim made from law to structured finance to banking, because I think most lawyers that we know probably struggle with finance or accounting. So how did he manage to do this seamlessly and like end up being a lawyer who's now running a bank? I think for me, I'm quite interested in that. And thank you very much. Great interview.
Thank you, Lebi. Yes, great question. So can lawyers do maths?
With great difficulty, Anita. So here's the thing. I think the question is valid, but I think one of the beauties about education and arts education is that it teaches you to learn. And I mean that sincerely. So an arts degree, I would argue, is fantastic because it broadens your mind and it teaches you to learn. Secondly, law is similar to that, because one of the things you learn in law is that to serve your client, you've got to be an expert in their business. So if your client is a manufacturer of semiconductor chips, you'd better understand what those things are and how they work. I had the privilege, as I say then, of studying, working at a law firm, deciding that I hated it, and being attracted by a colleague who knew what I was capable of, and then going to join a structured finance house and learning from ground up how to read an income statement, how to read a balance sheet. And because I wanted to learn, I bought the books and I swatted up and I learned. But even more important than that, one of the lessons you learn, I think, from university, is you learn where to find stuff. So you don't necessarily have to be the expert, but you learn where to go and find it. How to read a balance sheet. You're welcome, buy a book and learn how to read a balance sheet. And over the years, then learning by experience and learning by doing. I honestly was lucky in the sense that I had a passion for seeing the outcomes of the work that I do. So in structured finance, you advise a company, it's buying a cement kiln or building a bridge, or building a brewery, and you can actually go and touch and feel the brewery after you funded it. There's nothing more inspiring than that. So lastly, and you would expect this from somebody associated with the university, there's something about lifelong learning which makes a difference. To be open to saying, I don't know. And in fact, the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. So let me go and learn. I think is an important, habit to constantly learn and figure things out. And then lastly, actually, and have the humility to know when you don't know, and the humility to go and ask the people who know. So go to the FD and say, Chief, I don't understand that calculation. Please explain it to me. There's no shame in that. Yeah.
Yes. And that is absolutely essential, that humility. I fully agree with you, for us to realize what our limitations are, and to embrace that together with our strengths, and not to try and be the know-it-all, because that actually you trip yourself up by doing that. Sim, I see that there is another hand up, but I think our time has run out, unfortunately. As I've said, if you wouldn't mind just staying on just for a few minutes to read the comments that were given to you. I'm sure you haven't had time because they're wonderful comments that have been given by the participants. I want to you, Professor Tshabalala, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It has truly been inspiring to hear about your journey, to know that being a leader is very, very much being somebody that knows your personal values, that you make use of the opportunities that are presented to you, and that you live and treat people with dignity, and you live that out. We at the University of Stellenbosch Business School are exceptionally proud to be associated with you. I'd like to thank the audience also for your lively participation. The Leaders Angle of the Stellenbosch Business School are presented online regularly. We have MBAs and various other, we have development finance, leadership, coaching, various courses. If you're interested in any of them, there'll be some links in the chat for you to have a look at those and to make contact with us. We'd love to hear from you. Any other questions or inquiries that you have, you can also post those in the chat box. Professor Tshabalala, we thank you yet again for your time, and that is then the end, the formal end of this session today. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Prof.
Thanks. Salute you.